Okay, so in this lecture, I just want to talk a bit about the proper organization of code. So till now, we've been sort of writing simple, code snippets in our main function. Um, and the reason we do that is because main is the first thing that gets called when the microcontroller power is on. But as we go along this course, you will be writing code for projects which are quite a bit long, and will require many functions, or will require your code to be organized in many functions that need to be called at the appropriate time. And so, writing code in main is sort of, bad organization. And so, the right way to do that would be to basically use main only to do function calls, and basically sort of have your code reside in those functions that are being called. And for the sake of neatness, you want to place them in different source files based on the function, or based on the application that you're trying to do. So if you look at this example that we did last time, it's a simple example where we're sort of just controlling IOs. We're initializing IOs here before we get in the while one loop, and then here we're basically doing IO checks. Right? So a good way to sort of organize this is to sort of not have that. But let's put the IO initializations in a function, and let me call that function IO init. And obviously, I'm getting an error because I haven't sort of created the function. And so let's sort of find a place for IO init, and in that we'll be placing these three lines of code where we're initializing IOs, right? And so let me create a new source file. Any type of .c file is okay. And let me call this source file IOs. I'm going to have it saved in the same project folder. I'm just going to sort of hit finish. And so here I'm creating a source file, ios.c source file. Right? And we're going to use the source file to place IO in it. And so, here we have a new source file called ios.c. And in here, I'm going to place the function IO init. It's going to be of type void. And at the end, we need to have a return to go back to the calling function that called IO init. And in IO init, I'm going to be placing the IO initializations. I'm just going to cut this, place it under IO init. Okay, so we've sort of taken out initialization, place it in IO init, right? And one thing you should do is, if you sort of have a source file, if you're calling a function in another source file, you also need to create something known as a header file that links the source file with main.c, in which you're basically calling the function. And so to do that, we're going to go to source files again, right-click new, and we're going to create a new header file, xc16 header.h, or any .h file is okay. And we're going to give this the same name as the source file, which is ios. This is going to be a h file. Okay, so you have a bunch of things you sort of don't need these sort of lengthy messages, disclaimers. You can just delete them for the sake of neatness. And somewhere in here, you need to basically just declare your function. So the function we created was void IO init. So type void, and make sure you sort of have a semicolon at the end. And so we created a function. We created a source file ios.h in which we have IO init. I want to make this code a bit more neater as well. So let me sort of create another function in the same source file ios.c, in which I'm going to put the rest of these IO checks into it. So let me call that function IO check. And I'm going to sort of place it also in the source file. Make sure you have a return at the end. And then here, I'm going to place, the part of the code which is doing the input check and turning on or off the LED. So I'm going to put this here. I'll put it in iOS, IO check. Okay. Keep in mind, I'm sort of still getting an error for IO check, and the reason for that is we need to have a declaration for it in iOS.h. Hopefully that should take away the error. Yeah, okay, it went away. So in main.c, we've sort of cleaned up the code where we only sort of are using main to call functions, to do things. Right? And we sort of place the functions in a separate source file called ios.h, ios.c, and we sort of created a header file, a linker file known as ios.h. Right? Now, one thing we need to do here is, once these have been created, make sure you save these. Hitting Control S while opening each of the file. And one thing you need to do is, if you want to call functions in ios.c, you have to include the header file ios.h in main.c. And so the way to do that would be under hash include. I'm going to have a hash include. You can use the triangular brackets, or you can even use semicolons, and automatically it sort of auto-populates and gives you the option of including ios.h, which is the header file we just created. Just to double check. Okay, I think I'm getting an error. I should get an error here because there seems to be a bracket haven't closed. Okay, so once again, I'm going to save all the files. We'll compile and build to see if it runs without any syntax errors. When I run the code, just let pick it 3. Okay, so program verify complete here. So things seem to be okay on that side. Yeah, and the code seems to work on the hardware. So this is how I expect you to sort of organize your code. You can sort of have any initialization functions which need to be done only once before you enter your while one infinite loop. And in while one infinite loop, you can be calling functions. And so this is important to organize your code. It's also going to be important because we're going to be doing many driver projects, and we're going to be doing a couple of app projects. And so you will sort of, as the semester progresses, you will have many such functions where different parts of the code will reside that you may have to call or not call. And so it helps to sort of have them neatly arranged, neatly organized in different source files. Right? One thing to note is that the laws of global versus local variables still exists in the way we're written. So right now we're just basically dealing with functions which are voids. If you have any variables that you declare in ios.c, they're not going to be available in main.c, and vice versa. And so to do that, to have variables which are accessible in all source files, you need to create, you need to declare a variable as a global variable to be able to have it accessible in all in all functions in multiple source files, right? And so let's create a global variable, say in this file in ios.c. I want to use a unsigned int, and let me call it global var. Okay, so I want to create a global var, which is of the type unsigned int, and I want to be able to access it in main.c as well, right? So actually, I think I need to, sorry. And so the way to do that would be to actually declare this in ios.h, but you declare it as an extern unsigned int. And you also need to have a declaration of global var in main.c. So somewhere before you get into void main, you can declare unsigned int. Yeah. Might have a, yeah, V is capital. V is capital. Right? So when I do this, global var becomes a global variable that's accessible in ios.c and also main.c. Right? And so this is useful, when we get into things like interrupts, when we get into lengthy app projects where you're going to be having variables that need to be accessed, in multiple source files. It's good to sort of declare those variables as global variables. Right? And just to double check, it should compile without any errors, but I'm just going to double check. There you go, build successful. So that's all I want to talk about in this lecture is proper organization of your code and global variables.